From Galatians on Papyrus 46, we find an asymmetrically strong case for the resurrection of Christ compared to other belief systems. It's asymmetric because the historical evidence is noticeably harder to explain away when we compare it to the evidence for founding miracles of other belief systems. And I believe this asymmetry of evidence warrants a move from agnosticism to at least a rational, provisional, intellectual consideration of Christ. So, our reality is full of uncertainty. Um, we don't know for certain if we will even wake up tomorrow or if we could trust the people around us. We can't even be sure that we exist. However, we make decisions anyway, and we're pretty good at it. Um, we don't realize how much uncertainty there is in everything, and we're just kind of used to operating within it. So, one of the things that we make decisions about is testimony. So, testimony can be about something that happened an hour ago or 3,000 years ago. And if two or more testimonies contradict each other, we evaluate the relative strength of the evidence that supports them. So, of the things we ought to make our mind, we of the testimonies we ought to make up our mind about, we should make up our mind about the resurrection of Christ. It's pretty important because even if the entire Bible is false and the resurrection of Christ is true, then Christ is still of infinite importance. So Genesis and like all the Old Testament stuff could be false, and if Christ is true, then he is of infinite importance to us. So, since Christ might be of infinite importance because of the resurrection, it's worth investigating. But it's kind of understandable to be an agnostic because there are other testimonies that also might be of infinite importance. Uh, and they are usually mutually exclusive testimonies. So, for example, Islam says that Christ didn't die on the cross, and Christians are pretty confident he did. So that is a mutually exclusive testimony. And the truth can't contradict itself. So remaining undecided seems pretty safe in this situation, especially considering their claims of potentially infinite importance. However, if there is an asymmetry of evidence for one testimony, then it's worth making a non-neutral consideration for it. So if one testimony has stronger evidence, it's worth like not sitting on the fence. Across all belief systems of all founding miracles, the asymmetry of evidence and the explanatory resistance of the resurrection stands apart. It requires so much more effort to explain away naturalistically than other belief systems of founding miracles. And it gets like, and we'll talk about this later, but it kind of starts to feel contrived. The lengths that we go to, unless you challenge the credibility of the gospel account, which is what usually happens. So, about challenging the gospels, according to Christians, the four gospels are eyewitness testimonies of the ministry and resurrection of Christ. We have thousands of manuscripts across the Roman world, and they largely agree on what happened. However, the earliest surviving copy is over 100 years after the death and possible resurrection of Christ. So we have literally tens of thousands of manuscripts. But the earliest ones that we have are over 100 years after the event. So the usual joust is debating the credibility of the empty tomb narrative in the Gospels. Because if the empty tomb narrative is accurate to what happened in reality, then it gets really contrived trying to explain why the tomb was empty. However, if you say, well, I think that whole thing is historical embellishment, then you don't have to engage it, which is what the usual joust is. Why we talk about the credibility of the narrative. So yeah, is the sheer manuscript evidence that agrees across distance reliable, or is the time gap plenty of time for significant embellishment? That's kind of the question. So GP46. It is possible to make a very strong case for the resurrection after dropping the Gospels entirely. So no empty tomb narrative, no debate about the credibility of the Gospels. This would be like trying to make a case for Muhammad's prophethood without the Quran and just using hadiths, which is not easy. So we find everything that we need outside the Gospels in Galatians 1, 1 through 8, and 1, 10 to 2, 9 on Papyrus 46. So Galatians on Papyrus 46, GP 46. So why these verses? It's because they're immune to many of the critiques leveled against the gospel accounts. So the authorship of Galatians is undisputed to be Paul, like St. Paul, the Apostle Paul, across scholars, even highly critical scholars, which is very significant. Now, the normal joust about the Gospels is that the authorship is traditionally identified to be Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but it's not like confirmed to be them. So, because it's not confirmed to be them, uh, it could be somebody who came later and therefore not an eyewitness. However, Galatians is almost totally undisputed to be Paul, which is very significant. So we can be very confident from default that these are Paul's words. And a historical critical analysis suggests that Galatians was written within 15 to 20 years of the death of Christ, providing less time for embellishment or doctrinal development. It was written very recent after the death of Christ from a historical standpoint. And like most importantly, it's not a theological piece. These verses are just Paul expressing his opinion and sharing his biography. He's not trying to make a theological narrative, like it's not discussing the Trinity or the conditions for salvation in these verses, right? In these verses, he's literally just talking about his autobiography to people who already know him and what he's talking about. It's just a rhetorical like preface. There's little to no reason to lie about what he says here. So why Papyrus 46? Well, what is Papyrus 46? It is one of the oldest manuscripts we have of Galatians, dated between 175 and 225 AD. Really significant. It was written over 100 years before the Council of Nicaea. So this is usually where people might make the case that like the entire narrative was fabricated at the Council of Nicaea, or like huge parts of it. This document is 100 years before the Council of Nicaea. So we can be pretty confident that it wasn't manipulated at the Council of Nicaea because it was written before it. So the Council of Nicaea is significant because it kind of standardized like Christian doctrine and thinking. Before it, Christ followers were kind of disunified in doctrine, and it was kind of just like regional thinking. And so everyone agreed that Christ died and resurrected, but like the actual like theological relationship of like Christ to God and other things like the conditions for salvation, like where does Jewish law sit, right, was not like totally agreed upon. So this period of pre-Nicene disunity is very significant. We can have a lot of confidence in Papyrus 46 because it would have been very hard to form a coherent narrative when nobody really agrees, and then go manipulate all the copies of Galatians across the Roman world, not an easy feat, to fit a particular view. So we can trust these verses with a lot of confidence because they're mundane. They're not like talking about miracles or theology. It's just a mundane, biographical, rhetorical statement on a document that predates the Council of Nicaea by over 100 years during a period of significant doctrinal disunity. So we can have a lot of confidence in the GP46. So what about it? We get a trustworthy glimpse into the very early Christian situation. And from these particular verses, it's about 610 words, we can glean 3 points that make a complete naturalistic narrative relatively hard, but not impossible, of course, to form. Because it's so hard to form a complete naturalistic narrative compared to other testimonies in other belief systems, the evidence for the resurrection is asymmetrically strong. So here are the 3 points. We learn that early Christ followers believed that Christ died and resurrected. So the resurrection wasn't something that was innovated later, right? It from the get-go, it was kind of the core of this whole Christian movement. And Paul, on his own mundane testimony, violently persecuted the early church and was commended for it. So it's safe to assume it was unpleasant or very risky to be a Christ follower, especially early on. And by 48 AD, so about 15 to 20 years after the death of Christ, Peter, Jesus' brother James, who was originally a skeptic of Christ, and John were still acting as pillars of the nascent church in Jerusalem and were eyewitnesses to the resurrection. So, against these 3 points, we have to make a complete naturalistic narrative that explains the points. This is usually done by suggesting the disciples were deceived by an illusory experience, or that other theories just say that somebody lied in some capacity. So we'll start with illusion. It can be anything from like a dream to a hallucination or like a heat stroke illusion, right? But the strongest theory I have heard is that one or more disciples had a profound grief hallucination from the sheer grief they felt from losing their rabbi. So this is a very good theory because people don't really understand how big a deal it was to like follow a rabbi at the time. Like that was like every Jewish boy's dream. And so to lose their rabbi, especially via crucifixion, which was like the most humiliating and painful death like the Roman world could imagine, was must have been unbelievably crushing. So I would be surprised if they didn't have a grief hallucination in some capacity, because they're actually fairly common. I think it's something like 30% of people have some grief hallucination. And yeah, they're fairly common, and it does kind of explain how the disciples could be convinced that Christ resurrected without it actually happening. However, It has a numbers problem when we stretch it into a complete narrative. So, from the get-go, for this theory to stand, we have to assume that Christ did exist, did die, and the disciples were so convinced he wasn't coming back, they were in extreme mental distress, because if they thought he was coming back, they would have hope. And hope reduces their mental distress, which reduces their grief and reduces the propensity for a grief hallucination. So it's not impossible to have a grief hallucination with hope, but it just makes it less likely. So this is like a probabilistic thing. This whole exercise is a relative probability. So really important, the vast majority of grief hallucinations only last a moment or a couple moments, and typically only include one sensory stimuli. So it's like you turn around and you see the deceased person, or you think you hear their voice, right? But they're not actually there, right? So only one sensory stimuli. Whoever had an illusory experience needed it to be so profound, they would violently ruin their lives for it. They could have absolutely just gone back to their old lives and never had anything to do with Christ again. But they clearly didn't, as we see in Peter, James, and John. So whatever happened, it would probably have to be a prolonged, multisensory grief hallucination of a kind that has never been recorded, medically recorded, and ought to be exceedingly unlikely. So the kicker is a profound grief hallucination is really rare. So if multiple disciples had profound grief hallucinations, then that is so improbable it borders on miraculous, right? Like every time another person has a profound grief hallucination, the likelihood of it happening decreases, right? Now you could say that, oh, well, if one of them had it, it makes the others more likely to have it, which is fair, even though they might get hope from one, but it doesn't guarantee it. So it's like if the first time it happens is like sub 1%, and the second time it happens is like 1%, right? We're still multiplying unlikely probabilities. So we can clean this up by just saying, oh, well, only one disciple, perhaps Peter, had a profound grief hallucination. So we don't have to multiply any odds. We clean it up easily, say it's unlikely but possible that Peter had a profound grief hallucination. No additional probabilities to multiply. However, if only Peter had a profound grief hallucination, then Peter alone would have to convince the other disciples that he saw Christ, because they didn't see anything, right? So Peter would have to convince them so strongly they would ruin their lives for him. It's not like he was asking them to like go fishing with him. Like it's this would cost them a lot, potentially their lives. And they would all understand that they could also get crucified for doing this, which is one of the reasons they all abandoned Christ when he was captured by the temple guards. So even if Peter managed to convince the disciples, let's say that Peter did, he manages to convince all of them, even though they didn't see anything. The hardest part actually comes next. They have to convince other people. So, like, people tend to cling to their superstitions. And the climate of Roman Israel was to prefer a living Messiah. Now, crucifixion was an extremely humiliating way to die. It was kind of used, to kill criminals and like really like bad people in the eyes of Rome. So it was not the kind of person like your Messiah getting crucified was not a good sign for their case for the Messiahship. So if no one else saw anything, then Peter and the disciples' only hope to convince other people is via sheer fervor. And we see this kind of extreme fervor on the day of Pentecost, if the Gospels are to be believed. So here, the full catch-22 is revealed, the full numbers problem. To convince people effectively, they needed to have extreme fervor. It would be hard to have extreme fervor if they weren't really convinced. It would be hard to convince them unless they all had some major illusory experience. The more disciples that had a major illusory experience, the more statistically anomalous the odds. So if we make one part of the narrative easier to explain, like only Peter had a hallucination, it makes the other parts harder to explain. So it's like if only Peter had a hallucination, then how were the disciples convinced enough to convince other people through fervor? Because other people didn't experience anything and they didn't. And it's like, well, if Peter didn't convince any of the disciples, then how did he convince other people? Right? So this is just like, it's not impossible, but it's kind of interesting how well, this resists naturalistic explanation. It's like we have to multiply naturalistic low probability outcomes for it to make sense. Not impossible, but not likely. So could it have happened naturalistically in this way? Yes, absolutely, right? But notice how much harder we have to work here to explain the evidence we have. And that's just from 3 points from Galatians. So we have to multiply unlikely probabilities to make a narrative. And it does start to feel contrived. So the other option is that the disciples were convinced that Christ resurrected via falsehood. So if not illusion, perhaps falsehood. And this is not a crazy thing to suggest, as in any historical account. There is a real possibility that the person giving the testimony is lying intentionally or unintentionally. So we have already discussed the best unintentionally lying theory I'm aware of, and that's the grief hallucination theory. But now we will evaluate the naturalistic theories that someone lied. So there are many variations of someone intentionally lied in the resurrection narrative when trying to explain it naturalistically. The stronger ones I am aware of explain how the disciples were genuinely and excitedly fooled. So this basically is like the disciples weren't lying, but they were fooled. So when they got really excited because, let's say, they saw the risen Christ, right? Their fervor explains itself because they thought that they saw something miraculous, but it was actually like a conspiracy or they were lied to, right? So 2 examples are body double theory and swoon theory. So body double theory is that just Christ had a twin brother or lookalike ready to fool the disciples when he died. So this does require that the real Christ would be okay with dying an excruciating and humiliating death. And even if he was a first century Jew, like Christ, would be keenly aware that fooling the people in such a way would be the ultimate blasphemy. So blasphemy was kind of a big deal back then because everybody was convinced that God existed at the time, or at least some like iteration of God or gods. And if you were a Jew, uh, you were absolutely convinced that the capital G God existed and had like real outcomes in this life and the life after. So, first century Jews didn't really have like naturalism or atheism to lean on as an alternative. And so, this theory requires that a first century Jew would be okay with dying an excruciatingly painful death to commit the ultimate blasphemy and for zero material gain because he's dead. Maybe the doppelganger gets something, but in the narrative that we know, like even let's say this there was a doppelganger, he disappears also with no material gain eventually. So it's not impossible but not likely. It just starts to feel contrived. So swoon theory is a little more well known. Um, this is a much more conspiratorial naturalistic theory. So it presents the idea that Christ was secretly given some special drug without the disciples knowing, possibly by the physician Luke, to only appear to die on the cross to swoon. He would be then brought to a special tomb prepared by Joseph of Arimathea, who was maybe in a scene, and in the tomb he was resuscitated in time to appear to the disciples 3 days later. And this was all to fool the people of Israel, to change their mind from wanting a political conqueror, kingly Messiah to a spiritual revival Messiah. Again, fooling Israel. So, to its credit, this is a much better theory because it actually establishes a motive and gives the real Christ a way out without dying. Like, in this theory, Christ had something to gain, which was being identified as the Messiah by his disciples. Um, and he didn't die. Like, yeah, he had to go through the cross, but he didn't die. But it does hinge on an entirely like independent variable that was out of the conspirators' control. That Christ would not die on the cross or sometime before. The conspirators would not know precisely like what the Pharisees were going to do to Christ. They didn't know, like, they couldn't control when Christ was taken off the cross or if he was dead before then because he was severely abused even before he was on the cross, and would probably have massive blood loss by the time that he was on the cross. So, and the Romans would have to fail to notice that Christ wasn't dead, and not super likely because they're experts at crucifixion. So, let's say Christ didn't die and he made it to the tomb, and Joseph was there, and Joseph and Luke were there to resuscitate him. No modern physician would tell you that a person would be ready to walk healthily after 3 days. Why? Because when you get crucified, you get nails in the palms of your hands or your wrists and a nail through the feet, right? Your foot bones would be destroyed beyond the other tons of abuses done to you that your body undergoes when being crucified. Like, you could not walk or do much of anything, even after 3 days. So, and this is all considering that the conspirators would still be committing the ultimate blasphemy by fooling Israel. And worst of all, this theory doesn't identify the mystery drug that would enable fooling Roman executioners. It's never identified. It's just kind of hand waved. It's like, oh, there was some drug. It's like, okay, what drug? And what drug in first century Israel could do that? I don't know. But there was just some drug. And it's like, okay, well, that starts to feel a little contrived. So what we find is parts of the evidence for the resurrection can be explained naturalistically. However, explaining all the evidence requires multiplication of many unlikely probabilities. Again, not impossible, right? All of the naturalistic theories we've covered are possible. They're just not likely. So I have yet to demonstrate the relative strength of the resurrection compared to the founding miracles of other belief systems. So I'm going to do that now. So Muhammad's prophethood, and I'm going to engage Islamic tradition at face value regarding Muhammad's first two revelations and see if we can make a naturalistic explanation for them. The Islamic tradition is pretty clear that Muhammad earnestly wanted to solve the religious division in 6th century Arabia. And in my opinion, looking at his first and second revelation, he was probably given the psychological impetus to be a prophet by Waraka, who was a Hanif, after his first revelation in the cave at Hira. So what is the evidence for this? You have to look it up, but notice how specific his second revelation is compared to the very ambiguous first one, and how closely the second sounds exactly like what Waraka told him, considering the second revelation occurred after his visit with Waraka. So the first revelation is very ambiguous. It doesn't say much about Muhammad, and he goes and consults Waraka at the advice of his wife. And Waraka says, well, you're certainly a prophet, and you're going to be persecuted for your prophethood. And, you're like Moses and Gabriel, right? And so the second revelation almost says that verbatim because Waraka dies shortly after, and the revelations pause for some time for some reason. And then his second revelation sounds exactly like what Waraka said to him. So it's also important to notice that these revelations were not observed by anyone, right? And it's also even more notable how similar the practices and beliefs of Islam are to Hanifism. And Waraka was a Hanif. So if Muhammad was convinced he was a prophet by Waraka, then everything afterwards is just the product of his own convictions, right? Waraka told him you're going to be persecuted for being a prophet, and when Muhammad was persecuted, he was prepared, and everything after that just kind of explains itself. So we'll talk about Buddha's enlightenment. So Buddhist tradition varies, but the largest sects believe that he was born in escapist abundance. His dad was it like a king who wanted to keep him away from suffering, and so he leaves the palace at one point, and then sees like people dying and people sick, right? And so, and then he sees a ascetic who was content with like nothing, and so he goes and lives a life of asceticism, but isn't doesn't feel like it's fully, you know, complete. So he comes to the conclusion that you should live in moderation. Basically, I'm simplifying a lot, but I'm trying to condense a lot into like one slide. So he basically comes to the conclusion you should live in moderation, the center between the two. And after coming to this revelation, he was given immense wealth and personal magnification by King Bibisama and other nobility. So not a lot of people know this, and this shocked me too when I was studying the Buddha. He received almost instant support by like very powerful people, right? it he also didn't really make any metaphysical claims beyond diverging from the Vedic tradition on the Atman. Um, his teachings largely revolve around a philosophy of living, and it's not really like a religion as much as it is a philosophy. And that's significant because we're talking about like a testimony with significant metaphysical implications like the resurrection. So, no miracle required, he just came to the natural conclusion of his life experience, magnified by his powerful friends. So, to clarify very clearly, right, I am not saying that Muhammad can't possibly be the seal of the prophets or Siddhartha Gautama, the awakened one, the Buddha, right? They might have been. I can't know for certain, and I don't think either of them were intentionally lying, and recognize each may have a portion of the truth. And so Christians should consider that some of the Buddha's teachings are similar to Christ's, and Muhammad had a great respect for Jesus or Isa, right? A lot, like almost every Muslim has a great respect for Jesus. They just don't think he was like God incarnate or the Son of God. He was just a great prophet. So, in the face of this, the asymmetry stands. It is much easier to explain Muhammad's belief in his prophethood and Buddha's enlightenment than it is to explain the resurrection of Christ. Especially if we consider the relative strength of the resurrection, even after dropping the Gospels, and apply the same level of scrutiny and doubt to the testimony of other belief systems as we do to the resurrection of Christ. Like to recall, like we made the case pretty strong even after dropping the Gospels. And if we take Buddhist and Islamic tradition at face value, we can explain it naturalistically pretty easily. Muhammad's is a little harder than the Buddha's, but explaining the resurrection is way harder than explaining Muhammad's belief in his prophethood. So, this asymmetry is significant, right? It's significant for agnostics and rationalists, right? In the face of an asymmetry, considering how we engage most decisions against uncertainty in life, it seems to me to inform at least making an intellectual and provisional consideration for Christ on the basis of the relative strength for the resurrection. So we find an asymmetry, it warrants a non-neutral consideration. That is a rational strategy, and an asymmetry of evidence can reasonably prompt someone to not sit on the fence on the question, especially considering how pronounced the asymmetry is. So, anyway, I hope you found this interesting. I'm always happy to discuss this more. Part of the search for truth is, like being willing to find out that you're wrong. And so if you think I've missed something or haven't considered something, then please let me know. And I hope you have a good day.